President Trump announcing the framework for a trade deal with the European Union. The deal comes after months of talks and avoids a potentially destructive trade war. The framework calls for a 15% across-the-board tariff on imports from the 27-nation bloc, the EU. The president calls it the biggest deal ever made. His words, the biggest deal ever made. CNN's Matt Egan is joining us right now. Matt, walk us through this deal.
Well, Wolf, this is significant because it means that both sides have averted what would have been a self-destructed transatlantic trade war. A lot of the details here, though, they do remain murky. This is not a legally binding agreement. I haven't even seen a White House fact sheet on this. But one thing we do know is the tariff rate. This framework calls for a 15% tariff on imports from the EU. And this is lower than the 30% rate that had been threatened by the president starting on Friday. However, let's make no mistake here. This is not a cut to tariffs. This is an increase. It's an increase from the current level of 10%. It's an increase from the 2024 average tariff rate of 1.2%. And economists, they say that the bulk of these higher tariffs are going to be paid by consumers and businesses. And look, the EU is the biggest source of imports into the United States. Last year alone, the U.S. bought more than $600 billion of goods from the EU, everything from pharmaceuticals and cars to car parts, autos, alcohol, and machinery as well. As far as what else is in this, again, the details are a little bit murky. The president says the EU has agreed to buy $750 billion of U.S. energy. He says that the EU has agreed to invest an extra $600 billion in the U.S. and in a win for European consumers and U.S. businesses, there's a 0% tariff on U.S. exports to the EU. But at the end of the day here, countries that reach a deal with the United States, they face higher tariffs than they did a year ago. Countries that don't reach a deal, they also face higher tariffs than a year ago. And that's why Mary Lovely from the Peterson Institute, she told me that U.S. businesses and consumers still remain the biggest losers from these trade deals. Wolf?
And what do they say about the argument that this 15% tariff on all imports coming from the European Union into the United States, 15%, will raise the price of various products imported from the Europeans? It's basically a tax on American customers.
That's exactly right. And again, the EU is a major source of imports into the U.S. You think about it. Pharmaceuticals, aircraft, alcohol, all of these items faced dramatically lower tariffs just about 6 or 7 months ago. And now the question is, what does this 15% tariff do to consumer prices and to the overall economy? And Wolf, we're going to find out very soon.
We certainly will. Matt Egan reporting for us. Thanks very, very much.
Right, on his visit to Scotland, Donald Trump struck a trade agreement with Europe that ends a months-long standoff. He called it the biggest deal ever made. And it seems the European Commission president doesn't disagree. Have a listen.
It's a huge deal. It will bring stability. It will bring predictability. That's very important for our businesses on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, joining me now is CNN business and economics reporter Anna Kuben and Professor of International Economic Law, David Collins. Thank you both for joining us. And let me start with you. The French Prime Minister, writing on X that this is a dark day when an alliance of free peoples brought together to affirm their common values, defend their common interests, resigns itself to submission. The French Prime Minister certainly does not see this as the conclusion of a very successful deal, clearly, for the EU. Your sense?
Well, I think his sense is similar to many other European leaders, which is that this was essentially an exercise in damage limitation. So, yes, the 15% across-the-board tariff that Europe has now agreed to with Trump is much lower than the 30% they were fearing was going to be implemented on Friday. But let's remember, it is so much more than the 1.2% average tariff that was on EU goods to the US prior to Trump really relaunching his trade war at the start of his second term.
Is this a fantastic deal then struck by Donald Trump and just terrible negotiation on the part of the EU? I mean, how do you...
I think that's an accurate assessment. To me, this is a humiliating capitulation on behalf of the EU, and it really calls into question this amazing negotiating strength, this leverage that the EU is supposed to exert as a superpower on world affairs, it really makes you wonder, what is it actually doing for its member states if the UK can on its own get a better deal than this giant economy? So I think it's a real failure on the part of the European Commission in negotiating here. And obviously it's better than not having any deal at all at 30% or something. But this is really a wasted opportunity, I think, for the EU, and absolutely a victory on behalf of the Trump administration.
And let's have a listen to how Donald Trump feels about the deal.
You've done a fantastic job with regard to the trade deal. You know, they wanted a trade deal here for years, many years, through many different terms of different people, and you got it done. So I want to congratulate you on that, and it's a great deal for both. It brings unity. We didn't need unity, but it brings us even closer together. I think it's good for both parties.
That's the US then, the US president on the US-UK deal. So stepping back for the moment, this is a big week, of course. I mean, we've got this sort of Trump-imposed deadline once again for countries to sign up to deals. Otherwise, tariffs are going to go sky high on them. That is Friday, August the 1st. So this is always going to be a big week. What we've heard Sunday is this deal that you have described as capitulation. You have described as damage control. Others are describing as submission by the EU. Step back for a moment. What does this all basically mean? Let's start with the United States. Where are we at with Donald Trump, his trade deals, and the US economy at this point?
Well, Donald Trump has said that there is now 7 trade deals with America's trading partners. Now, obviously, that's more than there were a few weeks ago, but it's still significantly less than what there needs to be if we're talking about all of America's trading partnerships. But this is part of Trump's real crusade to redress what he perceives to be imbalances, unfairness towards America from US trading partners. Just to give you one example, the EU, that really has been in Trump's crosshairs for quite a while now. He has referred to the EU as being designed to screw the US, and he's called out tariffs, but also the non-tariff barriers that the EU places on the US, like a digital service tax, for example. So the bigger picture is that Trump is still very much pursuing his longer-term goal of achieving what he perceives to be fairness for America.
And David, one of the things that Donald Trump brought up today was that he would deal with the pharmaceutical deals or the pharmaceutical trade or the pharmaceutical tariffs soon. A few days ago, he threatened levies as high as 200% on imports in that industry. Now, I just want to get you some facts here. CNN reports that this threat is exposing China's tight grip on that industry. For example, China controls 80% of the raw materials required to produce amoxicillin, a relative of penicillin, of course. In this new chapter in the global trade war, it does feel as if, and it's where we started, I guess, with the Trump administration, that this is about China, ultimately. What do you make of his sort of fight against the pharmaceutical industry at this point?
Well, I think it's just another tool in his arsenal to inflict damage on China with a way to securing a deal from them. We know right now in Stockholm that's what's going on. And the more pressure he can place on these various strategic industries, like pharmaceuticals, the more likely he is to secure the deal that he wants to get from China, which I suspect will be forthcoming. Probably not in the next couple of days. I suspect there's likely going to be an extension on that, probably until October. But he's just flagged pharmaceuticals as yet another pressure point. And why not, if that helps him secure a tariff reduction or the intellectual property
Very briefly,
issues.
do any of these deals suit the WTO? Or are these deals that are ultimately flouting what are the multilateral rules that certainly you and I, not you, have grown up with over the years? I mean, where are we?
Well, I'm happy that you asked that. I don't often get asked that. No, I think you're exactly right. This is probably not WTO compliant, which is surprising from the part of the EU because they're understood as major supporters of the WTO framework and the US not so much. This is a violation of most favored nation. If you give one country a preferential tariff or preferential treatment, then you've breached the most favored nation obligation under the GATT, unless it's a formal free trade agreement. And this
these
doesn't,
aren't.
they're not. These are quote unquote deals, which is a phrase that we're all throwing around, but they're not formal free trade agreements as in treaties. Now they might become that, but I don't see any indication that that's going to happen for this, for obvious reasons. With the question of the EU, you'd have to get all of the EU member states because of these mixity issues. There's no way there's going to be US-EU free trade agreement in the next couple of years. And I would add the UK-US free trade agreement is probably also non-WTO compliant. But that doesn't mean that they're not good for the economy, but it's sort of, it's troubling for the multilateral framework, let's put it that way.
I'm glad you brought that up, because my last question really to you, Anna, is, what does this all mean for US, European, UK consumers at the end of the day?
Well, higher tariffs tend to mean, Becky, higher prices for the end consumer. So there are import taxes. So when you raise the price to import intermediate materials to make goods, and then manufacturers will usually pass on that cost to the end consumer. So many critics within the States around tariffs have said that this is essentially raising taxes on Americans and Europeans.
We'll see. Thank you both.